This
after
conference
this
will now
session.
be recorded.
So the session is now being recorded. I would like to share that for those of you who do not know and are new to the European Women in Payments Network, EWPN is a network for women in fintech and payments, banking and financial services in Europe. And our events focus on bringing women in payments together to learn about issues and trends in the industry, network with our peers, and celebrate women's achievements from across the payments ecosystem. For more information, you can, or if you want to contact us, you can go to www.ewpn.eu. My name is Alana Kazihan, and I'm a PSP sales manager at PaySafeCard, part of PaySafe Group. And I have officially joined EWPN 2 months ago, and I'm excited being part of this webinar with you. So first of all, shortly to introduce this session, we're all trying to adjust to the new normal, and we realize how overwhelming and stressful and uncertain these times are for all of us. We are caught between working from home, homeschooling for some of us, taking care of our families, keeping everyone safe, and sometimes we forget to take care of ourselves. And we're constantly functioning in a survival mode recently, I'm sure. And now more than ever, EWPN is reaching out to every single member of the community to support each other and as we forge through these stressful times. And with big information overload, many of us feel exhausted, and we, while appreciating the stress we're all under, we also want to use this opportunity to provide useful tips and tricks to help you fight isolation and bring our community together. And until this is over, we will be coming together every week to share, learn, or even rant, so that we, when we are weak, we can fall back on our EWPN tribe. This session with Dr. Alessandra Wall will be a three-part session, a three-part series. And if you want to ask her any questions at the end of the session, during the session, please send them to me via chat, and I will be reading them out after Dr. Wall presents. And just to present Dr. Wall, she is a licensed clinical psychologist and founder of Life and Focus Coaching. And Dr. Wall is a leadership and confidence coach who specializes in helping professional women succeed, and she partners with organizations who help women with that. And without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Wall. I think you're unmuted now, Dr. Wall. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
I will let you share your screen. 1 second.
I'll share it and I'll share it in just a minute, but I will just, if you're okay with it, talk for just a second or two before that. So my name is Dr. Alessandra Wall. The reason I'm here is first and foremost because by training I'm a clinical psychologist. And my area of specialty in psychology is anxiety and stress management. So as you might be able to imagine right now, that's coming in very, very useful. I'm also in much of the same situation as everybody else here, insofar as my business has been disrupted. But I'm on the end of disruption where I think I'm working more and harder and longer than I was when things were normal. And some of the strategies I'm going to share with you over the next 3 weeks are things that I try to apply, that I fail to apply, and that I'm working on. And it's probably one of the benefits of what I do is that I get constant daily reminders to pay attention to my own stress level, and I get constant daily reminders of the things that work to manage stress and anxiety. So I'm going to try to bring that your way. And my goal always when I present, let me get this into the right view. There we go. My goal always when I present is to try to make this a conversation rather than me just speaking at you. To keep this structured and organized, I think the conversation is going to start off in the chat, but hopefully after that we can go live. And my second goal is to make sure that we're not just dumping information, but that we're giving you something that is applicable, that you can actually use. So that's what we're going to do today. And as Alana mentioned, this is going to break down into 3 parts. Today, we're just going to talk about what stress and what anxiety are. I want to give you a framework to understand it a lot better so that you can manage it in your lives, but also since many of us are living with other people and dealing with their stress, so we can help the people in our lives manage stress. I'm the mother of 2 boys. I have an 8.5-year-old and an 11-year-old, and I'll talk a little bit later about how I see stress show up for both of them and what that means for me and how I see stress show up in my life. The other thing I'm going to try to encourage you to do in this session is just to build awareness around your stress. And then in the next time we meet, we'll start talking about what you can actually do to better address your stress and better address the problems that are leading to the stress. And then our very last session, we're going to talk about something that I think is being blown up right now for many of us, but I can tell you just from the work I do, so I'm a clinical psychologist, but I also coach women in leadership and confidence. So I see this professionally is our tendency to want to be everything for everyone, the guilt that shows up when we can't meet those perfectionistic standards, and how we deal with not being able to be the best employees, the best bosses, the best managers, the best leaders, the best partners, the best friends or children that we can be right now. So let's move forward on some of this. So what is anxiety? At a very, very basic level, anxiety is an offshoot or part of the same spectrum of emotion as fear. And fear is a very, very important, extremely adaptive emotion that is designed to help us survive when we're facing actual dangers or threats. So I live in San Diego, in California. I was going to say North Carolina, California. And around here in San Diego, there are a lot of small canyons, even in the urban spaces, there are small canyons. And in those canyons, you can find wildlife such as coyotes or even mountain lions. So if I'm presented with a mountain lion, over the span of evolution, my brain and my body has developed this adaptation to facing that danger. The second I come face to face with a mountain lion, there's a fear, a stress response that gets elicited in my body that allows me to gear up to either fight the mountain lion, which would probably not be my choice of action, or to try to evade the mountain lion. Anxiety, the way I like to think about it is that it's a much more modern evolution of fear. So if fear is the response to actual danger, then what anxiety is the response to perceived danger. This, just think about it as this sideways bottle model is probably one of the best ways of thinking about the anxiety you face day to day. And if you want to screenshot this, I'd highly recommend doing it. And then you can put it on your refrigerators or by your desks so you remember. But what happens when we get anxious is that we're looking at a situation. The situation can be running late for work, or finding out that our paycheck is going to be reduced, or finding out that we're going to be locked indoors with our children and have to be not just professionals and women, but also teachers. And when we look at those situations, we assume or we assess that there's a certain level of danger associated with it. Now, running late, the danger might be getting in trouble, missing an important appointment, looking unprofessional, right? The loss in salary clearly would come across as maybe the potential of not being able to pay your bills or falling behind on certain important payments. Right now, a lot of us are worried about or actually really facing job loss, right? And clearly being locked up in a house with your children for an extended period of times just presents a whole slew of potential dangers, including the possibility that they might not be that we might not keep them alive by the end of all of this, and not because of coronavirus. So what happens is we perceive a danger, and then automatically our brain jumps in and tries to figure out how much control we have over that potential danger. And when there is this disconnect between perceived danger and perceived control, in this space here, we have worry that starts to bloom. Oftentimes, and certainly as a psychologist, when I think about anxiety, what I notice is that people are overestimating danger. At its very worst, they're catastrophizing, right? Only looking at worst case scenarios as opposed to looking at the most likely negative scenario. And often, but not always, they start to feel like they have little to no control. And at its worst, what that is helplessness, right? Thinking there's nothing I can do about this. And when that happens, a vacuum is created. And within that vacuum, anxiety just blooms and grows and takes hold. So the next time you find yourself feeling worried, stressed out, anxious, nervous, or even scared, so those are all the same spectrum of emotion, I want you to just stop for a second and realize, okay, my brain just perceived some kind of danger. My brain just started to think that something bad could happen. And the reason I'm feeling what I'm feeling right now is because I don't feel entirely certain that I can avoid or combat this danger. We're going to go back to this model quite a bit in talking about why later on the tactics that we use to manage anxiety can be so effective, and also why sometimes we why our brains can work against us and make our lives much more difficult. But this is the model I want you to keep in mind. Anxiety is the interplay between perceived danger and perceived control, and we feel anxious when we perceive some kind of negative outcome and we tell ourselves that we are not going to be able to manage or avoid that negative outcome. So one of the things that's been happening for me, and part of the reason why earlier I said I'm spending so much time in conversations with so many people, is actually because at the beginning of all of this, I got really anxious. I have 3 businesses. One is my clinical psychology practice. You ladies are in my therapy office right now, right? The other one is my coaching practice, where I work with, as I said, women who are trying to move into leadership or women who are trying to build their confidence so that they can have the careers they want. And then the third business is speaking. And all 3 of those businesses were affected and are affected by the current status of the world, right? When that happened, my first reaction, my attempt to gain control, was to say, A, I have a plan. I'm going to continue doing business as usual. B, I'm actually going to ramp up the number of conversations I have, regardless of what those conversations lead to. So I'm spending my days, most days, speaking to people about how they're affected currently, what their plans are for the future, and how they're going to adapt to the economic downturn that's going to come after this. I do that with my patients 2 days a week. And outside of those days, I'm doing it all day long with women and leaders of companies. And what I've noticed, well, I knew this before, but I'm very much seeing it, is that people's anxiety is manifesting in all kinds of ways. And some people are very good about noticing that they're stressed or anxious and managing that. And a lot of people aren't quite that good. I'm going to take a break here because I want to make a distinction between stress and anxiety. Every single one of us right now is stressed. All stress is the reaction to external pressure or mental load. So when you change our environment, even if we're adapting very well to those changes, or if you're one of the women who's adapting very well, that change is stressful. Stress can be really negative, but stress can be good too. Think of the first few weeks or months of parenthood, or preparing for that, or trying to throw a big party for somebody. It's a stressful event, even though it's a pleasant, potentially pleasant event, right? So everybody right now is stressed. And then many of the people I'm speaking with, on top of being stressed, are also anxious. And that's what I mean when I say what I'm seeing is both that stress and anxiety are manifesting in ways that people sometimes recognize and sometimes don't. So usually when I work with people, especially as a psychologist, and we talk about them coming in and feeling anxious or stressed, what they report are things right here, things such as worry, tension. They talk about having uh, ruminative thinking patterns that wake them up early in the morning that they can't shake. They talk about the tension playing out as headaches or back pain. People will often mention loss of sleep, difficulties either falling asleep, staying asleep, or that thing where you wake up first thing in the morning and your brain will not quiet and you start trying to think about all your to-dos and how you're going to approach them and how you're going to survive the day, right? And those are very typical ways of for people to experience stress. But there are all these other ways in which your stress might be manifesting right now that I'm seeing people not necessarily uh, recognize as a stress response. So one of the big ones is procrastination. I keep on hearing from the people I'm talking to that either they or their teams are falling behind. And part of the reason they're falling behind when there's a conversation around it is that people are just really struggling to get started. They know what they need to do. They might even feel like they can, but they feel overwhelmed by the projects in front of them. And so they do everything but work. For me, everything but work is a load of laundry. I hate doing laundry. It is the bane of my existence, but I might find myself choosing to do that rather than sitting down to work on a project for work because under stress, that project feels overwhelming. The other thing I'm hearing a lot is people really struggling to concentrate. So they're not procrastinating. They really are trying to start on their work, but they find that they're constantly distracted. They want to focus, but they can only do it in very short spurts. Uh, they they're lacking creativity. When I work with people who are creative or whose job requires them to be innovative, this is another area in which they're seeing that those creative juices are not flowing, that they're struggling to come up with new ideas, to brainstorm. They're feeling very stuck. I happen to be trilingual technically. And I know yesterday I was on the phone with my cousin who's struggling with his own stress. And because I speak English all day long here, I couldn't find my words. I couldn't find my words in French. And this was unfortunate because he's going through some hard times and I wanted to make sure I had the right verbiage for him. But right after ending my conversation with him, I jumped on a conversation with a woman who's Brazilian who also lives in the US, and we started talking about it. And she says, yes, I noticed that when I'm stressed, I struggle to speak in Portuguese, right? So for some of us, that might be one of the ways where we see this, where French is my first spoken language, and it's the language that I grew up in, but suddenly what should be easy, what should be normal, is lost. Another big sign of stress that I'm seeing in people, and especially in women, is the tendency to stay overly busy, to not know how to disconnect, how to stop taking on projects, to not know how to turn off work, or when they turn off work, to immediately shift into doing everything else they need to do around their houses. I'm glad she didn't decide to do this, but for example, one of my patients is a single mother. She has two boys. I'm pretty sure they're 7 and 9. And they're both, before all of this, fairly anxious children who are dealing with an abusive father. So they have their own stress. They came into this with their own stress. And she heads a very large team and she can work remotely. But the first time I got her on the phone during this crisis, she told me she was completely overwhelmed by the task of teaching her children. So much so that she just let them be on their screens and play Fortnite on their Nintendo Switches because she just couldn't handle it. She was really trying to make things work and to be there for her team as their leader. She had a crew of people still working in her yard to redo the landscaping of her yard. And she told me that she was going to start remodeling her bathroom because she was stuck at home. And that thing where she just started trying to add more and more, despite just telling me how overwhelmed she was with everything she was doing, that need to stay overly busy, to do things, to check things off of your box, is often a symptom of stress and anxiety. And here's why. It's a way for us to try to feel more in control, right? So nothing's working, I can't control anything, but I can make this bathroom look slightly better. I've been wanting to do it for a while. Unfortunately, that would be a very maladaptive way of managing that stress of feeling out of control. And luckily, I was able to convince her not to start remodeling her bathroom on her own. So as we continue this conversation, and it is going to become a conversation, I really want you to think about how your stress is manifesting. How is it showing up for you? It might be some of the very typical things I described. Maybe you're spending a whole lot of time worrying and you can't shut that voice off in your head. Maybe you found that you struggle to fall asleep, or you wake up really early in the morning. You're sensitive to sounds and to light, much more so than normally. Maybe your sleep is fitful, right? And it's the quality of your sleep that's poor, not the amount of hours you're staying in bed. Maybe you too find yourself trying to do too much, trying to maintain currently the same standards and expectations that you had when you got a break from work, when you got a break from your home life, and when you had the access to a lot of services that would normally allow you to outsource your chores. Maybe you're falling behind in the things that you need to do because you can't get started. I can tell you, for me, there are two things that I noticed about my stress. One that I've known forever, which is that I get really irritable. I am what I like to call a social introvert. I love meeting people, and it completely depletes me at the same time. So even these virtual meetings, and maybe more so because they're virtual meetings, become really, really taxing. By the end of the day, I barely want to speak to my own family. I certainly can't get online. I'm part of a few WhatsApp communication groups, and I can't make myself chat with them. And they're going back and forth. And for me, it's just overwhelming to look at that. So my irritability is high because I feel overwhelmed by the amount of incoming data. And then the other thing I noticed, which is going to lead to me taking a vacation next week, not from my patients, but from everything else, is that I'm starting to lack empathy. But my job is all about empathy. So I know some people who might not recognize that as a symptom, but the lacking of empathy comes from kind of being overwhelmed by the amount of data coming in. And because I pay attention to how I'm doing, and I know that's not my new normal, I can recognize that for what it is. It's not because I'm a bad person. It's not because there's something wrong with me. It literally is just a little overwhelmed by the amount of information and distress I'm having to process all day long. And I get much more frustrated with it, right? So you might look at that within yourself. My 11-year-old son is tearful at like anything. We might say, he might ask if he can have ice cream for dessert. And we might say, no, you've had enough sweet things today. And he will start crying, which is not anything he ever did. This poor kid, I think, is going through the first starts of hormonal shifts in this context. And so he is crying on a dime. My 8.5-year-old, who's much more hyperactive, his behavior is off the charts. So he's like a dynamo, and he's just going, a lot more frustrating to be around. So if you are parents, you might see some of these behaviors show up in your children. Children's stress and anxiety looks different than adults, or it presents differently. But what we're talking about are regressions. They're falling backwards into habits of younger children. This is the same thing if you have a spouse or a partner or a roommate you live with, right? That you are not only dealing with the stress of the situation and your own issues, but you're managing and you're dealing with the stress that they have. And that ability to understand what anxiety and stress looks like and to recognize it for what it is will give you an opportunity, first of all, to address its impact on you. But then if you have the bandwidth, and only if you have the bandwidth, to also be there for them. The most important thing I wanted to make sure I highlighted today is that the number one first step you have to take to better manage your stress is to build awareness around it. You cannot change what you can't understand. You cannot change what you don't see. But here's what happens. So remember how I said earlier that when we're faced with a potential real danger, my mountain lion or being mugged, that our brain shifts into a fear response, the fight or flight. And that flight piece is about trying to avoid danger. Well, that avoidance behavior also kicks in anytime we're facing mental or emotional distress. So the go-to for most people when we're anxious is to try to avoid feeling what we feel. And unfortunately for us, we don't often do that by solving the problem. We do it by either denying the presence of the emotion or by masking it. There are a lot of typical things we do to treat symptoms that don't necessarily address problems. So if I have somebody come to my house, come into my office, excuse me, who tells me every night when I get back from work, I have to have a glass of wine to unwind, I'm going to have an issue with that. Not because I think that a glass of wine, a single or even a couple glasses of wine a night is a big problem. I'm not worried about addiction, but what I'm hearing is that you're walking back home every day so wound up, and that the only way you're managing that being wound up is by taking a substance that calms you down and by giving yourself a reward. So I might tell that same person that she can absolutely go grab a glass of wine, that the ritual around grabbing that glass or that time to slow down is a wonderful thing to have. But I also want her to stop and try to understand where her stress is coming from so that she can start thinking about how in the long run she's going to address her stress. We do this with the stress of not getting enough sleep. Many of us start our day with 1 or more cups of coffee or 1 or more cups of caffeinated tea. And a lot of us will say we have to have that. But if you're in a position where you're realizing that every day, in order to get going, in order to remove the brain fog, you have to have coffee, I want you to stop and ask yourself whether you're getting enough sleep. I love coffee, but I love the ritual of coffee. I love that first sip when it's really hot and just black coffee. I spoke to Alana yesterday morning, my time, 7:30. I was outside in my yard. I love the break that it can provide when I make that break happen. But if I ever realized I had to have coffee, I might consider going to bed a little earlier. So this thing that we do, either to mask the symptom or to just push the symptom away, is very typical. If you find yourself doing this, I don't want you to feel guilty or bad about it. I certainly don't want you to should all over yourself to say, I should do this, I should do that. All I'm saying is be aware that that is how most of us deal with stress and anxiety, and that in the long run, that's what leads people into my office. Most of the women I work with as a psychologist come to me because they've been facing something incredibly stressful for years and years and years. And because they're fighters, because they're strong, because they have so many responsibilities, they've just been shoving that stress aside and it catches up with them, right? So step 1, and what I'm going to have you hopefully focus on over the next 2 weeks, is building awareness around your own anxiety and around your own stress, and learning to recognize when stress is showing up, how it's showing up for you, and what's triggering it. I don't even need you to do anything about it, because what I know is just building that awareness, you on your own will take steps to manage it better. So there's a number of methods that I'll be sharing that I use consistently with my coaching clients, with my therapy patients, to help them manage stress and anxiety. This is the process I'm going to ask you to use over the next 2 weeks. And actually, as I see the screen, I'm reminded that I need to send Martha or Alana a handout just to help you if you want to kind of keep track of this. But many years ago, when I noticed that there was this tendency for people to treat symptoms but not address stress. I came up with this 5-step check-in method to help people in 30 seconds to 2 minutes throughout their day better recognize and address stress. And here's the way I think about it. In a regular day, if you're lucky, you wake up fairly calm and rested. And as the day progresses, your stress builds up and builds up and builds up and builds up. And you end your day right here. And right here you come home and you need 3 glasses of wine or 2 hours of TV or that long hour-and-a-half bath in order to get to a place where you feel somewhat relaxed, well enough to go sleep and to not feel like your day was just a ball of stress. What these check-ins allow you to do is to start your day, and as your stress increases, to stop, evaluate it, do something about it, lower your stress, and it'll continue going up, and lower your stress. And I joke that with the method, you end at a 1 glass of wine versus a 3 glass of wine. You know, you end at a, I love this show, but I'm going to put myself to bed because I'm tired, versus I love this show and I'm so stressed out, there's no way I can go to bed and I've done nothing for myself today, and I stay up an extra hour-and-a-half only to wake up with a sleep deficit the next day because I absolutely felt like I had to unwind before I could go to bed. And it starts this way, and I can't see your faces, so I'm gonna just hope that you do it with me. But I'd like you all to take a second and to just close your eyes and to scan your body from your head all the way to your toes. And notice where in your body right now you're carrying physical tension. Not if, because I guarantee you are. Just from talking, I'm carrying physical tension around my diaphragm, around my throat, and around the back of my neck, right? And my legs are crossed, and I can tell you, like, my muscles are really engaged in my legs being crossed right now, right? So scanning your body from the top of your head to the tip of your toes, where in your body do you feel tension right now? That's the check-in piece. When you've noticed where that tension lies, the next thing I'd like you to try is, as you breathe out, and there's no need for a special breath, I'd like you to focus on that point where you're noticing the most tension and see if, as you breathe out, you can allow the muscles in that space to let go just a little bit more, right? This isn't meditation. I'm not asking you to spend 20 minutes, trying to get out of your head. It literally is noticing that you carry tension, taking a second to breathe so you can let go of some of that physical tension. And I'm going to explain in a second why that's so important. And then the next step that I'm hoping you'll practice over the next week is learning to stop and just ask yourself, what is this about? So let me talk for a second about why taking the time to stop and relax and breathe is so important. When our fight or flight response kicks in, when that fear response kicks in, or when we get very, very anxious, our system is designed to shift to be extremely reactive and to be quick at what it does. Cognitively, what that means for most of us is our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that evolves last, and the part of our brain that is designed to help us plan and strategize and think through problems, is compromised. So paradoxically, under high levels of stress, we don't think as well. We can't strategize as well. We can't plan as well. So this fear response starts with our bodies getting tense, with certain hormones and such as adrenaline and cortisol and certain chemicals internally being boosted in our system, and everything is designed to deal with evolutionary dangers, not with being late or worrying about not getting a paycheck or hearing your child ask you for the 50th time that day to fix something for them when you're just trying to get your work done. And so that stress response starts with my body gets tense, my mouth gets dry so that I stop digesting, my breath gets short, and my breath gets short so that I can taken enough oxygen so I can get oxygen into my major muscle groups. So that would be my thighs and my core. It's the reason why when you're watching a really suspenseful movie and the suspenseful part ends, you suddenly realize you were holding your breath. And this prefrontal cortex thing kind of shuts down so that you can just start working on instinct. By relaxing your body, you start shutting down that stress response, and you give yourself a chance to start thinking through your dangers and your controls much more logically. So these 3 steps, check in, relax, assess, are the first 3 of this 5-step check-in method. And these are the steps I would like you to practice over the next 2 weeks. Remember, when I started, I said, my goal anytime I get to talk to people and I have the privilege of sharing information with people is to make sure that I don't just dump information, but that I provide them with something that they can put into action immediately. My goal is to create change, not just to educate or create aha moments for people. Neat. So I've been a psychologist for 15 plus years. I've worked with hundreds of people on this. And give me just one second. Speaking about dry mouths. And so this system works really well. I'll outline the rest of it for you. So I started off calling it the 5-step check-in, and I was doing a talk one day and a woman raised her hand in the back and she says, Dr. Wall, like what? She goes, you know, if you change the second letter you change the second word in what you wrote out, it spells out an acronym. And she said, I love acronyms. It makes it so much easier for me to remember things. I look at her and say, well, what's the acronym? She goes, crap. She goes, if you change breathe to relax, because I used to say check in, breathe, assess. We'll talk about the next 2. She said it'll spell crap. So the 5-step check-in, or thanks to this lady, the crap method, is check in, relax, assess what is going on right now that I'm feeling tension or experiencing tension. Address what can I do in the next 2 to 5 minutes to manage my current stress, the tension, and whatever's going on. And the P is for plan. In assessing what's going on, do I realize that my stress is due to a larger problem that I actually need to sit down and strategize around? And if so, I need to put aside time to plan for my day, excuse me, and to make sure that I'm not just managing symptoms, but that I am addressing the problem so that I can truly address the stress. So that's your homework. As I said, I will, and I'll send it right after this, I will send a quick handout with those first 3 steps to allow you over the next 2 weeks, a few times a day, to stop, look at your body, scan them, notice where you're carrying tension, notice where you're carrying stress. Let go of some of that stress and then figure out what is causing these issues. So for those of us who are moms, you can use this same method with your children when you see them, or if you have a partner at home, right? Whether it's a roommate or a family member or a spouse, or a domestic partner, you can go up to them and instead of saying, you're super stressed, to say, hey, I'm about to do this 5-step check-in thing. Do you want to do it with me? All we need to do is look at where we're carrying tension, try to breathe out and ask ourselves what's going on right now that we're stressed? What's going on right now that we're tense? And what can we do about it? One of the things I want to just share, and this is my parting piece, and after this I can answer questions and we can talk together if you'd like about the kind of stress and anxiety you're facing, what you're seeing around with your family members and with your loved ones, or with your teams if you're managing teams, and what you can do to help them and support them. I'm open to answering all of those questions. Is to recognize that what I'm asking you to do actually requires a fair amount of courage. If our natural response to stress and anxiety is to avoid it because it is distressing, right? It's emotionally uncomfortable. Then by taking the time to slow down and to actually pay attention to and focus on your own stress and anxiety and look at it, I am asking you to be very brave. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. What I'm asking you to do is going to cause short-term discomfort for long-term mental and emotional health. Like the long-term benefits are definitely worth it. But if you're one of those people who naturally tends to medicate her stress, or who naturally tends to just push through because she has things that she needs to get done, or distract, right? Watching TV, playing games on her phone, being online all the time, then asking you to not engage in those behaviors for a second, to actually pay attention to your stress, is asking you to take action in a state where you will feel discomfort and potentially fear. And it's important for you to recognize that, because if you don't, it's going to become it'll become a place where resistance can seep in. You will find 1,000 excuses and reasons for why you didn't bother doing this, and all of them will seem, and many of them will be justified, but they all perpetuate the problem. So I am going to see, there we go, stop sharing my screen and go back to talking to you ladies. And that was it on my end. Again, the big takeaways as far as I'm concerned, if you had to explain to somebody later on today what this talk was about, I would hope that you could go up to them and say, you know, what I found out is anxiety is really what happens when we perceive a danger and we perceive that we don't have control over it. So anytime I feel anxious now or worried or stressed, the question I have to ask myself is, what's the danger and what can I do about it? And the other thing I learned is that my stress might be showing up in a lot of different ways that I don't recognize, so I have to pay attention to it. And the first thing I can do to manage my stress or anybody else's stress is learn to become more aware. And if you leave and that's what you get from this right now, and you practice those things, I will consider myself very successful in talking to you ladies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wall. Do you mind sharing your screen with us once again so that we have your contacts up there, just in case anybody comes up with some questions after the session and would like to ask you?
Yep. And I would say the best way of getting in touch with me is probably that email.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. This was very insightful. And I think I'll give you a little break before people start sending questions, so you can sip a glass of water. You can either send us questions. Good. You can either send us questions in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and I will unmute you, speaking to the participants, and you can ask your question yourself. For me, I think the biggest takeaway was recognizing my anxiety now in what you presented. I am normally socially very, very busy and my calendar is constantly full. And the biggest anxiety I had was in the first few days where I had to cancel all of the events in my private calendar in the upcoming weeks. And suddenly I saw an empty calendar with all of my social engagements completely cancelled. I had an anxiety of thinking, well, what's going to happen now? And then I started getting very busy, as you mentioned, and you know, just doing anything possible to stay busy. And I started baking. that kept me calm. But now, luckily, after a few weeks, the anxiety level has gone down. Yeah. So I see some questions popping up. And by the way, once again, if you would like to raise your hand, I will now switch off my camera. If you would like to raise your hand to ask a question, I can unmute you as well. Do you also see the questions in the chat?
Yep.
Great.
So while I wait, I mean, I'm hoping you ladies have questions or even comments, right? One of the nice things about this time that we have is a lot of us have the same anxieties, and we'll talk about this in part 3, but I think a lot of us feel like we have to show up like we have it all together. and we don't. I made the point earlier in sharing with you me noticing my lack of empathy, because I'm supposed to have it all together, right? I'm a psychologist. I'm supposed to be able to handle people's stress and anxiety. I'm supposed to be calm and level-headed. I'm supposed to be caring and warm and empathetic. And I am most of the time, until I realize that somebody's talking to me about panicking because they can't go to the beach this summer, and I find myself wanting to shake them, right? That's not my normal response. That's lack of empathy. I know that how many of you are currently having virtual happy hours, virtual coffee dates, virtual social dates with friends on a regular basis? I don't know if there's a way of raising hands, but
maybe we just quickly write us a chat. You are.
So as you think about it, how many of you at times feel overwhelmed by the request from friends to yet again at the end of the day jump on another Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, WebEx virtual meeting? Because I know for me that's one of those things. I want to connect with my friends. I want to check in. I want to know how they're doing. And yet when I wake up in the morning, I don't necessarily, my mother lives in France. I have an aunt in Milan. My cousins are all in Paris. I have friends around the country in America. I have a lot here in San Diego, and I want to check in with them. But also, I just, exactly what Simone was saying, I don't feel like I have time for private chats. Like working and being a mom, and then trying not to be impatient with my spouse takes so much energy, and somewhere in there I want time for myself too. And competing with wanting time for myself is I should be checking in with that friend. I should say yes to this happy hour that everybody says they're going to do. I should text. It's just a text, except a text starts a slew of conversations. And that adds to the stress. It has nothing to do with holding on to our jobs or job insecurity or worries about health and how our family members or friends or loved ones or neighbors might be affected by the virus. It seems silly, but it's such a significant stress for most of us. I'm reading Elena's question, or maybe Alana can read Elena's question.
Sure. So I have found many insights about my anxieties, but the question I have is actually about my husband. He has always been into late nights and watching shows while sipping wine, etc. These days, even more than usually, I'm concerned about how this impacts his health in a long run, and was wondering what's the best way to help him without throttling him and stressing him even more.
That's a really good question. My guess, Elena, is that you're not the only person out there who's seeing a stress response from people that has them concerned or worried, and feels conflicted about how you demonstrate concern and how you move people into action without, first of all, being rebuffed or being perceived as pushy or nagging. I think it starts with a question. Right, our tendency, and not a passive aggressive question. So our tendency is to come into situations like this and say, don't you think you should be getting sleep instead of watching more TV and drinking wine? Don't you think you've been drinking a lot of wine? I see that the midlight's getting a little like bigger. Wouldn't you rather, go move around, come and play, read a book, whatever it is? And those are questions, but they're very passive aggressive, because we're hinting at something without saying what we want to say. And then there's the aggressive piece. You shouldn't be watching TV. You shouldn't be drinking so much wine. You should be taking care of yourself. You're putting yourself at risk, right? And that approach isn't going to work. So the question, anybody here who grew up watching Columbo, which depending on your age, you might or might not recognize, but in France, they played all the Columbo episodes all the time. But I love using the Columbo method, which is this kind of bumbling, I'm not quite sure, I'm trying to understand approach that allows you to address problems in a very non-threatening way. And what that looks like is going up to him and say, hey, I've noticed you spend even more time now in front of TV, and kind of isolating, or however you want to put it, Elena. I'm wondering what that's about, right? I'm wondering if I should be concerned about it. I'm wondering if you're concerned about it. Right? We're not trying to be passive aggressive, so we're not telling him what he should do with some question that's not really a question. We're really bringing up, I've seen this, and I'm not sure I understand what it's about. I'm not even sure that it's a problem, but it's concerning me. Could we talk about it? If you're lucky, the response you get is an open and engaged one. If you're typical, the response you get is, everybody has to deal with the stress the way they need to, or it's some kind of rebuff. And to that, my recommendation as somebody who theoretically should care about you is to say, I hear you. I'm not trying to tell you how to manage your stress. What I'm trying to tell you is I'm worried. So can we just take 5 minutes to please address my worry for a second? And maybe you can reassure me so that I don't have to worry about you. Elena, what do you think of that? Do you think it's realistic for the type of relationship you have with your husband? Okay. Right, it just depends. I know my husband, being a psychologist, I get a lot of don't psychoanalyze me, which I'm not trying to do. I think I become a psychologist because I am the way I am, not the other way around. So I have to be very careful when I ask those questions. If I go up to I went up to my 11-year-old the other day, and I told him, I said, I said, you cry a lot lately. I'm trying to understand. Yes, you cry so easily right now. I think you're stressed. What do you think? Right? It's just a question, and it's coming, from a place of concern, because to be honest, there are equally as many times where I look at him like, oh, don't tell me you're crying about this. Why are you crying about this? It's just dessert. Pavlina says, I feel like I'm in a constant prioritizing process where I need to weigh out what to tackle next, which task, which project, which channel. And then all the time I get new emails, messages, incentives, and then I end up getting very stressed and not able to concentrate. How can I stay calm during this process? I don't know if anybody else felt stressed as I was reading that, but Pavlina, I get stressed just reading that, honestly, right? I could feel like I have the sense of being bombarded by information. There are a couple things we're going to talk about next time, but one of the big pieces of advice, and I'm curious if you have it or not, and I don't know, I mean, we could, as people answer, unmute them if it's easier than typing, but I'm wondering if you currently have some kind of structured schedule to your day, where you start your workday at some point in time, you end your workday at some point in time. There's a moment where you turn off your checking of emails, text messages. Does that?
I think I'm unmuted now, right?
You are.
Ah, okay. Because I didn't need an allowance. So first of all, thank you. I thought it's maybe easier that way. So right now during home office time, I kind of have a schedule, right? So I sit every day and start at 9, and after Azure Fix, I just end my working day at 7. So while being in home office, I kind of manage it better. But I mean, now it's not the normal situation, right? So when I start working again and traveling, it's harder to have those consequent time schedules.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like a large problem. Yeah.
Right. So you're saying this isn't even just now, this is all the time. So one of the things, I read a lot, and when I read books, I try to pick up at least one thing or think about how can I use this for myself, right? Again, I'm always trying to move out of just creating aha moments for myself or for the people I talk to, and think about how do we make this useful. So many years ago, I read The 4-Hour Work Week, which I don't think it's possible to work 4 hours. in a work week. But there are two pieces of advice that I took from that and that I have now regularly prescribed to my clients and my patients. One has to do because, and this goes with the prioritizing, with realizing that your list of to-dos on any given day is infinite. Because they're the big to-dos, maybe you're finishing a project, maybe you need to like send a specific document to someone or call a client, and then there are all the small ones. Reply to this email, put a stamp on this envelope, talk to this person, check this other email, right? And it just builds and builds and builds. And if you were to create that list, you would realize it probably very rapidly hits more than 50 items. So the piece of advice that I try to use and that I definitely share with others is to say, on any given day, really think about what are the 1 to 3 top things you want to get done and focus first and foremost on those, because otherwise it's never ending. And I know I see this with my life. If I start writing an article and then I leave my LinkedIn open in the background and I hear every time somebody messages me, and then I have my email and the emails come in, I find myself constantly getting pulled right and left and being way less effective. And at the end of the day, feeling like I was harried, but I didn't get much done, right? But all day long, I was being pulled right and left. So sitting down and thinking of
what I mean, like by in the end not being able to concentrate because you constantly think, is this what I'm doing right now the right thing, or should I reprioritize because there's a new email or something like that? So what I try to do is like just to shut down my Outlook or my emails and my Slack channels and to concentrate. So I already try it, but I still trap into this situation again and again.
Yeah, and so part of it is realizing, yes, right. So at least you have some good habits, right, where you're already starting to shut those conversations so that you can monotask instead of multitasking. Although we women, our brains are designed to multitask very well, we still function better when we're mostly monotasking. What you notice is still at the end of the day, there are 1,000 other things that you coulda, shoulda taken care of, and that's never ever going to change. There is no place, there is no time in our lives until we die when the to-do list ends. And if we don't realize that and we hold ourselves to the standard, we hold this expectation that we should be able to get it all done, then we create a pressure that is completely unrealistic and an expectation that is completely unrealistic. So one way to do that is to learn how to set boundaries and limits with other people. You said you're already setting boundaries and limits with yourself, which is the first person you need to do this with. But the other people, you can do it. So the other thing I got from Tim Ferriss, is the name of the offer, from Tim Ferriss, was to use an autoresponder. And I used it for about 6 months to get most people in the habit, and now I just tell people verbally. But the autoresponder would basically say, I only check my email from this time to this time, right? These are my windows for checking my email. And what I was sending out as a message is just the sense of, don't expect an immediate response from me. I will get to this. And after a certain hour, for me, it was I check my email at 1 p.m. and at 6 p.m., right? At the middle of my day and the end of my day. Because I didn't want to start my day by checking email, because that derailed me. Right? There's too many other people's needs and I can't prioritize if I'm focusing on what everybody else needs. So those are some of the strategies. You can do that on a Slack line or things like that, where you just tell people, hey, I'm off for this period of time, but if you have a question, I'm going to be open and available to answer these questions or to look at these emails during this time, unless it's really urgent, in which case you can contact me here.
We have.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's imperfect.
Sorry, one more question that was sent to us via email. If you don't mind answering it, do you have any advice for parents with children who are not able to help their children with schoolwork and are carrying guilt for not being able to help?
Yes and no, it's a big question. So my first reaction is, what a terrible predicament to be in, right? And I think all of us have a certain level of that right now, but some of us are more fortunate. Maybe we have the time, depending again on where you live, on what your primary language is, on what language your kid is speaking, you know, the fluency to help them. One is, guilt is the emotional response to the thought, I did something wrong. And one of the first ways to really start managing guilt is to realize it's a really useful and important emotion, but it is just there to help you write your moral compass. So you have to ask yourself, is your inability to help your child because you're choosing not to, because you don't care about them, right? Is it actually a byproduct of you not caring, doing something wrong, being a bad parent? Or is it a natural byproduct of the circumstances you're in? Meaning you have to work, and you have to work so that you can pay bills and so that those children have food and clothing and housing and something to go back to once school starts again. Is your inability to help them because there is a language barrier? My father is American, and as I said, grew up in France. I grew up in the Middle East until I was 7, and then in France until I came to university in America. But when we were in France, unless we were working on math, he couldn't help me with anything, right? It doesn't matter how brilliant he was or how willing he was. There was a language barrier that made it very difficult for him to provide the support. So is the inability to help because that language barrier comes in? Is the inability to help because the way the teachers are trying to structure work is something that's difficult for you to comprehend, or simply because you don't have the patience to be a good teacher to your children? One of the things I realized through all of this is I am not meant to be a stay-at-home mom. I knew that before, but this confirmed it. I'm not meant to be a stay-at-home mom, and I'm certainly not meant to be a teacher for my children, right? I do not have the patience to be a good teacher to them and for them. So when you're looking at that guilt, I want you to stop and first and foremost ask yourself, am I not helping them because I'm choosing to, because I don't care, or am I not helping them because I can't? And if the answer is because I can't, I have to remind myself, then it is not because I'm a bad person, and it is not because I did something wrong. So do what you can. The other thing I like to remind myself right now is that every other kid in the neighborhood is also getting subpar education. So they will be fine. This is a very, very short moment in time that most children will be able, because children are resilient and their brains are plastic, to come back from. The other thing, depending on your school system, I know our teachers are constantly reminding us that that they understand that our kids are most likely going to fall behind academically. And so everybody is going to work with these different standards. Ultimately, you want to try to show yourself the same compassion you would show somebody else. So if you're thinking of what you can tell yourself in your head, I would like you to think about what you would tell your best friend if he or she came to you and said, I just can't do it, right? Would you speak to them as cruelly as you speak to yourself? Would you judge them the same way you judge yourself? And if the answer is no, can you try to stop and apply that for yourself?
Thank you. I have 2 more questions that were sent via email earlier. The first question is, what tips do you have for people who are already dealing with mental health issues on top of this?
One is if you're seeing a therapist, and continue to see them, right? So I know that when this first started, a lot of my patients stopped seeing me, even though I was doing teletherapy before. So if your therapist has the ability to do teletherapy, and all that requires is a computer and an internet connection or a phone, right? Teletherapy, it would be better if it could be face-to-face, but you can do it by phone. Continue seeing your therapist. I know that some of my patients said that they were backing off initially because they wanted to make sure they gave space to other people. But if your therapist has managed her schedule or his schedule well enough, they're not overbooked, right? So continue seeing them, give them a call. The other one would be slow down, right? Slow down and get rest. It is incredible how much lack of sleep can exacerbate mental health symptoms. It can be the difference for somebody who's depressed between feeling okay and feeling suicidal. For somebody who's anxious, between feeling worried and feeling completely out of sorts and panicked. So one of the biggest things for somebody other than staying in touch with their therapist is to make sure they're getting enough sleep and enough rest, to make sure that they're implementing those structures in their days so that they're stopping. The method that I talked about, I would highly recommend practicing it, right? Part of managing mental health issues is being aware of them before they overwhelm you. Catching your anxiety, catching your depression, catching your worry, catching that negative self-talk before it's become so miserable that you react to it through a maladaptive behavior. And last but not least, reach out to other people. There's a tendency in people who have mental health issues to worry about burdening others. The way you bypass that is when you reach out to somebody, say, so I'm going to trust you to let me know if I overwhelm or burden you or you need space. I have to be able to trust that you will let me know if that happens, because if I can do that, then I don't have to worry about it. And I can come to you knowing that when you can't take it anymore, you will come to me. Right? So it's about building that trust. It's about speaking up and saying what you mean and trusting that the other person is going to come. But sometimes you have to set the stage for that to happen. So see your therapist, get enough sleep, do the 5-step check-in method, right? Check in on yourself several times a day so that you can manage the stress and what you're feeling, and lean in to your support group. But if you're worried about being a burden, let them know that that worry is there and ask them to be honest with you when they need a break from your problems so that you don't have to worry about that.
We have one more question, so actually 2 questions now coming in. So one is, as we exit our respective lockdowns but maintain social distancing, how would you manage the anxiety of a looming infection or other people not complying with all the safety measures without staying in the safety of your home?
That's a really good question. I think there are a couple things. One is you can only do what you can do, right? So I love that you introduce this idea of other people not complying with all the safety measures, because there are always going to be other people not complying. So it's going to start with you making sure you comply. That might mean that you're always the one crossing the street. You're always the one in a line moving 6 feet away from other people. The other one would be, I got to use your judgment, and I'm sure you have great judgment, to know which situations aren't worth the risk. So for example, I have a patient who's pregnant right now and is going stir crazy and she just wants to go to a store. But it's not worth the risk for her right now, even though things are good here in San Diego. California managed this very, very well. We're not New York, we're not dealing with those kinds of numbers. But realizing that whatever you can outsource, outsource. And the third thing is to, as best as you can, calmly engage in conversation with people who are doing things that bother you. Oh, I know you guys have this in Europe. I don't know where else that we have it, but we have that app called Nextdoor. And I notice on Nextdoor, which I don't go on very often, same reason I don't go on Facebook or Instagram, that people love to berate other people and shame them for approaching things differently. People love to have a say on how everybody else is living their life. And because that exists, we tend to be very bristly and dismissive when we're approached about our behavior. The tone and the way you approach somebody can change that. And again, we come back to either that question or a polite request versus a you should. So instead of saying, hey, you should be 6 feet apart, to say, hey, it actually makes me really uncomfortable to have you this close. Would you mind? I'll step away. Would you mind also stepping away? That conversation has to come every once in a while. If you're going to meet somebody who's going to come back at you aggressively and is going to be dismissive, there's not much you can do about that, but you might be surprised by how often somebody stops and actually feels contrite and a little bit guilty about not honoring and not respecting your needs. One thing I would say, sorry, one last one, Aika, about that is, I did speak with a patient yesterday who said she noticed that she had a lot of anxiety about going out, and she noticed that that anxiety is probably not healthy. And she wants to make sure that as we exit the shelter-in-place restrictions that we have here, which we're just, I mean, I think we have another month here in California, not in America, but in California, that she wants to make sure she doesn't develop a phobia of being around other people. And so for her, I said, build slowly. Start by first going out in spaces where you feel comfortable, where you can have enough room, and then slowly build that up, but make sure that you're staying home or you're isolating is not a response to fear, that it is simply a response to an actual threat.
Thank you very much. So I think we have some more questions, but we will send them to you via email and prepare them for the next session. I don't want to keep any of the participants too long. We have already gone over time. Thank you very much for your session today. And I just want to remind that this is a 3-part series with Dr. Wall. The next series, so the next session will be taking place on 7th of May. But our next session with EWPN webinar is taking place next Thursday on the 30th of April. And the topic is Parenthood and Homeschooling. And the second session, just as a reminder, with Dr. Wall will take place on the 7th of May, and we will focus on crisis-proofing our mind. Once again, you can reach out directly to Dr. Alessandra Wall. We will be following up with sending you the handouts and obviously the recording of this session. Thank you very much for all the insights. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for the questions. And thank you, Dr. Wall.
Thank you, everybody, for your time and your trust. Really appreciated.
Have a great